My name is Luna Carpenter, and I was 15 years old when my father died. People always say that grief comes in waves, but for me, it felt more like the ground just vanished beneath my feet. One moment I was a normal teenager worrying about school and friends, and the next I was standing in a quiet room, surrounded by condolences that didn't mean anything because none of them could bring him back. My father wasn't just a parent, he was stability, structure, the kind of man who believed that if you planned carefully enough, you could protect the people you loved from chaos. He kept everything. Old receipts labeled folders, neatly stacked documents. I used to tease him for it, telling him no one needed paperwork from 10 years ago. He would just smile and say, "One day you'll understand." I didn't know then how much he meant that. The funeral hadn't even faded from memory when my mother started changing. At first, I thought it was grief, manifesting differently for her. Everyone mourns in their own way, right? But it didn't feel like mourning. It felt like replacement, like she was trying to overwrite him before the ache could settle in. Conversations about moving forward came too fast. Mentions of someone new slipped into her sentences like accidents that happen too often to be accidental. His name was Robert Hale. One day, he was just a name. The next, he was sitting in our living room like he belonged there, smiling too easily, touching things that still felt sacred to me. My father's chair disappeared first, then his tools, then the mug he used every single morning. When I asked where things were going, my mother would sigh and say we needed space. That change was healthy, that I needed to be more flexible. Flexible, at 15. What hurt the most wasn't Robert himself. It was how quickly my mother made room for him by shrinking the space my father had occupied. It felt like watching someone erase a chalkboard while I was still reading the words. A few months later, everything shifted again. My father's lawyer called me in. I remember sitting in that office, my feet barely touching the floor, feeling wildly out of place. He spoke gently, carefully, like he was afraid his words might break me. But what he said didn't break me. It stunned me. My father had left everything to me. Every property, every account, every asset, all of it. Nothing to my mother. I didn't even know how to react. I was a kid. Suddenly I owned more than most adults ever would. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like responsibility dropped into my hands without warning. The lawyer explained that the will was airtight, that my father had planned for every possible challenge. I couldn't access anything until I turned 21, but ownership was legally mine. When my mother found out, she smiled. At least she tried to. But I saw it, the tightness around her eyes, the way her voice faltered just slightly when she congratulated me. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed something would go to her. Something always had. At first, she played supportive, told me how proud my father would be, told me how lucky I was. Then the suggestions started. Gentle ones, casual ones. Wouldn't it be nice if I shared a little? Didn't I want to help make things easier for everyone? Then one night, she sat me down and asked me to transfer one of the properties to her. She framed it like a favor, like a kindness, said it would help Robert feel secure, like he'd truly belong, like giving him my father's house was some sort of emotional welcome mat. I remember staring at her, feeling something cold settle in my chest. I told her I couldn't even if I wanted to. The will wouldn't allow it. And honestly, even if it had, I don't think I could have done it. That wasn't just property. That was my father making sure I would never be powerless. The look on her face when she realized she couldn't change that? I still remember it. She tried to hide it. But resentment has a way of leaking through. From that moment on, something between us shifted, and I didn't know it yet. But that will wasn't just an inheritance. It was a warning. By the time I turned 16, the house I grew up in no longer felt like mine. It still looked the same from the outside. Same pale siding, same crooked mailbox my dad had refused to replace because he said it gave the place character. But inside, everything felt rearranged around me, like furniture shifted just enough to make you stub your toe if you walked through the dark. Robert's presence was everywhere now. His shoes by the door, his jacket draped over the back of a chair that used to belong to my father, his voice filling the silence my dad had left behind. At first, I told myself I could tolerate it. He wasn't cruel, not openly. He didn't shout or insult me. That almost made it worse because it gave my mother plausible deniability. Whenever I felt uncomfortable, she'd brush it off, as me being sensitive, still grieving, still adjusting. According to her, everything I felt could be explained away by time. Time would fix it. Time would soften it. Time would make me see how lucky we were. But time only made things clearer. Robert had 2 children from a previous relationship, Evan Hale, who had just turned 18, and Marissa Hale, 19, and already talking about moving out about college plans and independence. They were polite to me, distant in that way people are when they don't really care whether you exist or not. But my mother treated them like fragile glass, like they needed constant reassurance that this house, my father's house, was theirs too. She bent over backward for them. If Marissa mentioned liking a certain brand of coffee, it showed up in the pantry the next day. If Evan complained about the internet speed, my mother upgraded the plan without hesitation. Meanwhile, anything I asked for was suddenly something we'd have to think about or not in the budget right now. And then there were the trips. At first, they were framed as suggestions. My mother would smile and say, "Wouldn't it be nice if you spent the weekend with your grandparents?" Or, "You know your dad's parents miss you." This would be a good chance to visit. It always coincided with family outings, beach weekends, cabin getaways, little trips she described afterward with exaggerated cheer, like she was narrating a scrapbook I was never meant to be in. She never told me I couldn't come. She just made sure I didn't want to. As a kid, you internalize things like that. You don't confront them head on. You tell yourself you're imagining it, that maybe you do want space, that maybe it's better this way. I spent more and more time at my grandparents' house pretending it was temporary, pretending it didn't sting every time I heard about another family memory I hadn't been part of. Looking back now, I think my father knew. I think he saw something in my mother long before I did, a tendency to prioritize comfort over loyalty, peace over principle. Why else would he leave everything to me and nothing to her? People like to romanticize love, but my father was practical. He didn't leave room for sentiment to undo his planning. By the time I turned 17, the tension that had been quietly humming in the background snapped into something sharper. Robert stopped pretending he was just a guest. He started acting like the house belonged to him. It began with comments about chores, about rules, about respect. He'd tell me I needed to contribute more, that I needed discipline, that I needed to understand my place. Every word landed like an insult, wrapped in fake authority. He wasn't my father. He wasn't even my stepfather. He was a man living in a house he didn't own, trying to rewrite the hierarchy because it made him uncomfortable, and I refused to play along. Whenever he tried to assert himself, I reminded him calmly, pointedly, that this wasn't his house, that my father had paid for it, that legally it belonged to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth did enough damage on its own. My mother hated that. She said I was provoking him, that I was being disrespectful, that I needed to understand Robert was part of our family now. She used that phrase a lot, our family, as if repetition could make it true. The more she defended him, the clearer it became. This wasn't about blending families. It was about control. And control was something Robert couldn't stand not having. The arguments escalated. Small disagreements turned into standoffs. Every meal felt tense. Every shared space felt like a battlefield. My mother kept insisting things would settle down if I just tried harder. But I already knew the truth. Trying harder was never going to make me smaller, and that was exactly what they needed me to be. I just didn't know yet how far my mother was willing to go to make that happen. By the time everything finally exploded, it felt less like a surprise and more like an inevitability I'd been walking toward for months. Robert had fully settled into the role he'd assigned himself. He spoke like the house answered to him. He criticized how I left my shoes by the door, how late I stayed up studying, how I responded when he spoke to me. Every correction came packaged as concern, every order disguised as guidance. And every time I pushed back, my mother looked at me like I was the problem for refusing to adapt. I tried for a while to keep my head down, to avoid confrontation, to limit interactions. But you can't stay invisible in your own home forever, especially when someone is actively trying to erase you. The breaking point came over something small. That's always how it happens. Robert had decided I wasn't pulling my weight. He stood in the kitchen one afternoon, arms crossed, telling me it was time I learned responsibility. He spoke slowly, deliberately, like he was lecturing a child who didn't understand consequences. Something in his tone snapped the last thread of restraint I had left. I told him he wasn't my father. I told him he didn't get to dictate my life. And I told him clearly that this wasn't his house. The room went silent. His face flushed, red jaw tightening like he was holding something back. My mother rushed in, eyes darting between us, already bracing for damage control. She demanded to know why I was always so hostile, why I couldn't just show respect. The word respect echoed in my head like a bad joke. I asked her why he deserved respect when he showed none. That was when she said it. "This isn't working," she whispered, rubbing her temples. "We can't keep living like this." For a moment I thought she meant he would leave. I was wrong. She looked at me not with anger, not with grief, but with exhaustion. The kind that comes from choosing the path of least resistance over and over until it hardens into a decision. She told me it might be best if I stayed somewhere else for a while. That space would help. That distance might cool things down. I waited for her to take it back. She didn't. When I asked if she was really asking me to leave my house, she sighed and said it wasn't just mine, that it was our home now, that Robert and his children deserved to feel comfortable too. That was the moment I understood. She wasn't choosing peace. She was choosing them. I went to my room and started packing without a plan, without a destination, just knowing I couldn't stay there another night. Every item I touched felt like evidence of a life I was being quietly pushed out of. My hands shook as I stuffed clothes into bags, anger and heartbreak blurring together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. My grandparents saved me. When my grandfather pulled up that evening, I didn't cry. I just got into the car and stared out the window, watching the house disappear behind us. The house my father had left me. The house my mother had chosen to give away, piece by piece. Living with my grandparents felt like breathing again. They didn't ask me to explain myself. They didn't minimize what had happened. My grandmother made room for me like it was the most natural thing in the world. My grandfather told me I was always welcome, that no one had the right to make me feel disposable. My mother still visited. She acted like everything was temporary, like she hadn't shattered something fundamental between us. She brought boxes of my belongings over and spoke in soft, apologetic tones about doing what was best for everyone, about keeping the peace, about how I'd understand one day. I nodded. I listened, and I stopped believing her. Because if peace required me to disappear, it was never peace to begin with. By the time I graduated high school, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone take my future from me again. Life with my grandparents settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost unreal after the constant tension I'd left behind. Their house was smaller, older, filled with creaks and the smell of old books and morning coffee, but it felt steady, predictable, safe. No one questioned my right to exist there. No one treated me like an inconvenience that needed to be managed. For the first time since my father died, I slept through the night. My mother still came by occasionally, always with the same carefully practiced script. She told me she loved me. She told me this wasn't permanent. She told me she was just trying to make things work for everyone. Every sentence was designed to soften what she'd done, to reframe it as sacrifice instead of choice. I listened politely, because that's what I'd been trained to do, but something inside me had gone quiet. The part of me that used to hope she'd suddenly see me again, really see me, had finally worn itself out. She wanted absolution without accountability. I wasn't willing to give it. College became my escape plan. I poured everything into my studies, into building something that belonged to me alone. My grandparents supported me without conditions, without guilt, without reminders of what they'd done for me. They never used love as leverage. That alone felt revolutionary. During those years, I thought a lot about my father, about how meticulous he'd been, how intentional. I replayed conversations we'd had when I was younger, moments that hadn't seemed important at the time. Offhand comments about security, about independence, about never putting yourself in a position where someone else could decide whether you were allowed to stay. He had known. Maybe not the exact details, but enough to prepare for them. By the time I graduated, I wasn't the same scared teenager who'd been shoved out of her own house. I was cautious, grounded, and very aware of what I owned, not just legally, but emotionally. The properties my father had left me weren't just assets anymore. They were options, leverage, proof that I didn't have to ask for permission to exist. One property kept resurfacing in my thoughts. The house. The same one my mother and Robert were still living in. The same one I'd been told wasn't just mine when it mattered most. I hadn't driven past it in years, but I knew every corner by heart. It was solid, well located, perfect for renovation, perfect for renting, perfect for turning into something useful instead of something painful. I didn't rush the decision. I thought it through the way my father would have. Numbers, timelines, consequences. I knew reclaiming it would reopen old wounds. I knew my mother wouldn't take it well, but I also knew something else. If I didn't take control now, I never would. So I planned to talk to her, to be civil, to give notice. I wasn't interested in revenge. I just wanted my life back. When I finally went to the house, no one answered the door. No car, no lights, nothing. I waited, called, texted, left messages that went unanswered. Later that evening, my grandmother casually mentioned they were on vacation. Somewhere warm, somewhere carefree. Like the house was theirs to leave whenever they pleased. That was when something inside me hardened. I had tried to be considerate. They had chosen to ignore me. And that told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. I waited longer than I needed to. That's the truth I had to admit to myself once the silence stretched on for days. I checked my phone more times than I should have, half expecting my mother to finally call to acknowledge the message I'd left, to treat me like someone whose voice mattered. She never did. Not once. No missed calls, no texts, just nothing. It felt deliberate, and that hurt more than the inevitable argument ever could have. Legally, there was no question. The deed was in my name. I paid the property taxes. I carried the responsibility while they enjoyed the comfort. Emotionally, though, it took longer to accept what logic already knew. They were never going to take me seriously unless I forced them to. So I did. I called a locksmith and changed the locks. Standing in front of the house while it happened was surreal. I watched unfamiliar keys slide into unfamiliar hands, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift back into place. When I stepped inside afterward, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like evidence, proof of how thoroughly my mother had overwritten my father's presence with her new life. Robert's furniture, Robert's photos, Robert's sense of entitlement layered over walls that had once held my childhood. That night, my phone exploded. Voicemail after voicemail, missed calls stacked on top of each other. My mother's voice came through shrill and furious, demanding to know how I could do this to her, accusing me of disrespect, of cruelty. I listened to them all before finally answering the phone. She didn't let me speak at first. When she finally paused, I told her I'd tried to reach her, that I had plans for the house, that I wasn't taking it back without notice. I was giving them 2 weeks. Time to find somewhere else. Time to move their things. Time I wasn't legally required to give. She said I was heartless. I told her I was being fair. The next morning, I went back to the house to prepare for renovations. I didn't expect them to be there. I should have. They were waiting in the driveway like a wall. My mother looked tired, eyes red, but Robert looked angry in a way that felt rehearsed. He stepped toward me like he thought intimidation might work. I didn't back up. I told him plainly that he had never owned the house and never would, that the timeline stood. 2 weeks. My mother cried, said I was abandoning her, said I was acting like my father, but not in a good way. That one hurt, not because it was true, but because she meant it as an insult. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I repeated myself and left. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next day, my mother stormed into the backyard while I was taking measurements, screaming before she even reached me. Accusations flew. Guilt was weaponized. Sacrifices were tallied like debts I was expected to repay. Then Robert's daughter came outside. Marissa, 19, pale, crying, one hand pressed to her stomach. My mother said the word like it was a shield. Pregnant. For a moment, everything went quiet. I felt the weight of what they were doing, how carefully they'd timed it, how deliberately they'd chosen this revelation, hoping it would break me. I felt sorry for her, but I didn't change my mind. I told them again 2 weeks. I walked away while my mother screamed after me, calling me selfish, heartless, ungrateful. I kept walking because if I stopped, I might have faltered, and I couldn't afford that. After that day, the pressure didn't come from my mother anymore. It came from everyone else. The first call was from an aunt I barely spoke to. She didn't bother with small talk. She went straight for the throat, telling me she was disappointed in me, that my mother was devastated that family doesn't treat each other the way I was treating her. I listened in silence, gripping my phone so tightly my hand hurt, waiting for her to ask why I'd made the decision I had. She never did. That pattern repeated itself over and over. Cousins, family friends, people who had never once checked in on me when I was 17 and sleeping in my grandparents' guest room suddenly had very strong opinions about my character. They all told the same story. My mother was a victim. Robert was just trying to protect his family, and I was cold, calculating, ungrateful. Not one of them offered to take my mother in. Not one of them offered money. They just wanted me to fix it. At first, I tried explaining. I tried laying out the facts calmly, rationally, the way my father would have. I told them the house was mine. I told them I'd given notice. I told them I'd been forced out of that same house years earlier. Most of them didn't even let me finish. They interrupted with sighs and comments about how I was too young to understand, or how I was letting money change me. That one almost made me laugh. Money hadn't changed me. Money had protected me when my own mother hadn't. The guilt crept in anyway. Late at night, when the house was quiet and my grandparents were asleep, I replayed my mother's crying face in my head. I thought about Marissa and her pregnancy. I wondered if I was doing something unforgivable, something I'd regret forever. Family has a way of burrowing under your skin like that, even when you know you're right. My grandmother noticed. She didn't lecture me. She didn't tell me what to do. She just sat with me one evening and said, "Your father left you that house for a reason. He trusted you to know when to stand your ground." That grounded me. I started ignoring the calls after that, muting messages, letting voicemails pile up. If they were so concerned, they could step in. They could help, but they didn't want solutions. They wanted a scapegoat. As the days passed, I focused on the renovations. I met with contractors, finalized timelines, ordered materials. Every practical step forward made the emotional noise a little quieter. I wasn't doing this to punish anyone. I was doing it to build something for myself, something stable and independent. By the end of the first week, the guilt loosened its grip. I stopped feeling like a villain and started feeling like an adult making an unpopular but necessary decision. My father had prepared me for this, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. He had taught me through planning through foresight that love without boundaries eventually turns into control. I wasn't going to let that happen again. When the 2-week deadline approached, I knew they weren't going to leave quietly. Everything about their behavior told me they were waiting for one last opportunity to break me. I just didn't know how public they planned to make it. I knew the moment I pulled into the driveway that this wasn't going to be simple. Cars lined the street. People I recognized and people I didn't stood in small clusters, whispering, watching, waiting. It felt staged like a courtroom without a judge where the verdict had already been decided before I even arrived. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. If they were hoping I'd break down in front of an audience, they were going to be disappointed. My mother rushed toward me the second I stepped out of the car. Her face was streaked with tears, voice shaking as she launched into a speech she'd clearly rehearsed. She talked about betrayal, about how I was her daughter, about how she'd never imagined I could turn my back on her when she needed me most. The words were dramatic, heavy, meant to pull at every instinct I'd ever had to protect her. I listened. When she finished, I told her calmly that the 2 weeks were up, that I had given her time, that this house was mine. She shook her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing, said I was being unreasonable, said no one could find a place that fast, said I was tearing the family apart. Each sentence landed softer than the last, like she was running out of ammunition. Then Robert stepped in. He was louder, angrier. He accused me of acting like a landlord instead of a daughter, of abusing my power, of kicking them out with nowhere to go. I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. I repeated the same truth I'd been repeating for weeks. Legally and morally, this decision was mine. That's when the others joined in. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly felt entitled to weigh in. They talked about loyalty, about compassion, about sacrifice. One of them said I should be ashamed of myself. I let them talk, let them exhaust themselves. When there was finally a pause, I told them this wasn't their decision, and it never had been. The hardest moment came last. Marissa stepped onto the porch, one hand on her stomach, eyes wide and pleading. She asked me how I could live with myself knowing I was putting a pregnant woman out on the street. Her voice cracked, and for a second the old guilt surged back. But then I remembered being 17, standing in my bedroom, stuffing my life into bags while my mother waited for me to leave. I told her I hoped she found somewhere safe. I told her I was sorry. And I told her the answer was still no. My mother screamed after me as I walked away, saying she'd never forgive me. I didn't turn around. I didn't slow down. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing through the weight of everything that had just happened. It hurt, but it also felt final. The renovations began the next week. Walls came down. Floors were replaced. The house transformed into something new, something functional, something unburdened by the past. I watched it change from a distance, feeling a quiet sense of closure settle in. I don't speak to my mother anymore. Not because I don't love her, but because love without boundaries almost destroyed me once, and I won't let it happen again. My father gave me more than property when he planned for my future. He gave me permission to choose myself. And this time I did.